Hello and welcome back. My name is Jennifer and I make stuff. And in this video I'm gonna show you how to create a realistic paint job on a metal sculpture. So this is what the sculpture looks like that I'm going to give a realistic paint job. As you can see, it's a silver metal bison skull, and the first thing I'm going to do is actually start working on the actual skull part of the sculpture, and I'm going to do the horns as the last part. And I'm going to use acrylics for this, and I'm going to start with a mixture of titanium white, burnt umber, and yellow ochre. And I'm going to create a base color that is in between the highlights and the shadows, so I have a perfect base for the other effects I'm going to add later. And as you can see, I have added some masking tape around the base of the horns so I won't accidentally get any paint there. Especially since I'm working in layers, I want to make sure that the surface is clean from any paint so I can have all of the textures show up much better once I start working on the horns. And for the base coat, I'm not adding that thick of a layer, but it's pretty opaque because I still want the textures of the actual skull to show through each layer of paint that I'm adding. And first I'm using the paintbrush to apply the paint, making sure that I cover up the entire surface of the skull. And while the paint is still wet, I'm going to use a sponge to create more of a textured look on the surface of the skull and also minimize all the brush strokes that I had added when I used the paintbrush. And this is also going to enhance the illusion of a realistic skull. Another great detail about using the sponge to add some texture is the fact that when I'm going over with the other layers like the dry brush and the wash and all that, it's going to capture all of those textures that I'm adding with the sponge, and also it's going to make the layers of the paint stick much better than if the surface would have been smooth. This is also going to increase the effect of an aged, weathered skull that has been out in nature and being exposed to the elements where the surface is starting to get this kind of textured effect instead of having a smooth surface. For the next layer, I'm mixing a color that is a few shades brighter than the base color that I had added, and this one I'm applying with sort of a dry brush application, meaning I have less paint than before, so it will be a little bit transparent so you can see the base color peeking through, and also it's going to give some interesting textures and color variations to the skull. And the application process that I'm doing is going back and forth between the brush and then using the sponge to first of all minimize the brush strokes, but also distribute it a little bit more even around the entire skull. And the third layer is all about dry brushing highlights here. And this layer is pretty much the brightest shade that I'm going for. And this one is just me stippling on as little paint as possible and just going over those areas that I want to add more highlights to and going back and forth. So I go with as little paint as possible, then just build up till I get to the brightness that I want. And as a final step with the dry brushing highlights, I'm using the side of the brush, just brushing it on all the edges of the skull, just to enhance those edges, to give them some highlights, but also adding a little bit of sharpness and contrast. Obviously, I realized after this that maybe I wasn't really that necessary for me to do this now because of the next steps that I'm going to do after this. But still, it gave this kind of layering effect. So the more layers, the more depth and more realism is going to show through. So I wasn't really that bothered by the fact that I did this highlighting process before I did the shadows. So it's all up to you how you want to do this process. When the bright acrylic paint had dried, it was time to start working on the wash and the shadows of the skull to obviously add more contrast and depth to the skull, and also add sort of this kind of antique vintage aged look, so it had this kind of discoloration in the skull. So this one is applied as a wash, meaning I had mixed in a lot of water with the paint, and the mixture that I have made here is with Ivory Black and the burnt umber, and I mixed in a little bit of yellow ochre with the mixture just to sort of give this kind of a discolored, dirty look instead of having that warm tone that I would have gotten if I only used burnt umber mixed in with the black. And this one I'm doing the same as before with the process of back and forth between the paintbrush and the sponge. So I'm painting on with the paintbrush and then I'm stippling with the sponge to remove the excess paint and making sure that the majority of the paint stays in all the cracks and crevices and holes and all the parts that I want to have shadows in. And this is where the textured surface comes into play that I added to the base layer with the sponge in the first step of the painting process. Because here you can see that some of the wash actually stays on the skull, even though I had wiped off the majority of the excess paint. And this is going to help with all those color variations in the skull and give more of that depth instead of being just a bright, creamy white skull. One thing that is very handy when you want to give realistic effect to a surface is to have some reference pictures when you're doing this. And I was looking at some pictures of some real bison skull, and I noticed that in some of the aged skulls, some of the older looking skulls, they had some discoloration that was a little bit more of that dirty greenish yellow tone. So I decided to mix in more of that yellow ochre with the burnt umber and the ivory black to brighten up the wash, and started to paint it on areas that I wanted to have this kind of discoloration, and had the reference as inspiration when I did this. So I just painted on in some random areas that I thought looked pretty much what it looks like in the reference pictures that I was looking at, and tried to do something similar to that. Just like I did before, just painting it on with the paintbrush and then wiping off the excess paint with a stippling motion using the sponge. And as a final step on the skull, I'm going to bring back some of the highlights because it looks very muddy right now and I want to bring back some of that contrast. So I'm going to, in a dry brush, again using the sponge with as little paint as possible and just stippling on all the highlighted areas on the skull, and also some of the edges of all the cracks and the edges around the eye sockets and the nostrils and some of the teeth, just to add more of that sharpness and contrast to the entire sculpture. And this is going to enhance more of that depth that I'm going for, and also bring back some of those brighter skull tones. It's also going to mute down all of those discoloration and help with everything just blending in much nicer together. And also going over a little bit with the brush just to sharpen up some of the highlights in areas that I wanted to just enhance the contrast and make some areas just stand out much more. And I'm applying the paint using the paintbrush, just like I did with a sponge, in a dry brush application, back and forth until I get to the amount of highlights that I want and the contrast and effect that I'm going for. For the skulls, I'm going to use a base coat of just the Ivory Black, which is a black that has sort of a brown reddish undertone to it, so it's not jet black with that bluish tint to it. So just like I did with the skull, I'm doing an opaque layer, but it's still a thin layer, so the textures of the horns are going to show through the paint. And this layer I'm applying using only the paintbrush, and enhances also the textures of those lines in the horns by applying all those brush strokes going in the same direction as the lines on the horns. And this is going to enhance more of those textures when I'm going over with the dry brush highlights later. Using the brush again, I'm going to mix in some burnt umber with the black to add more of a brighter shade to the horns. But this layer I'm actually applying a little bit more random, so I'm not filling in the entire horn because I want the black underneath to show through. But I want to have a little bit of color variations around the horn, and I want to build up in different layers of shades to enhance those tones. And this application is going also in the same direction as the lines of the horns to enhance those textures. And the third layer is much more of the yellow ochre and burnt umber in the mix, and this one is very random. So I'm applying the majority of the paint on the ends of the horns, and then it starts to fade into pretty much no paint when it's getting closer to the base of the horn. And I'm not filling in the entire horn, I'm just applying it in more of that kind of spotty pattern that I could see in some reference pictures, but focusing on having more of that shade at the tip of each horn. I did the same mixture again, but with more of the yellow ochre this time, so I could add more of this start of some highlights. And this one is applied in a dry brush technique, so it will capture all of those highlights of the textures that is going around the horn. Like I did with the other layer, I'm focusing on adding the majority of the paint at the ends of the horns, and then it starts to fade into less and less paint when it's getting closer to the base. And the last two final steps are going to be some highlights using the sponge, and this time I'm stippling on the paint and focusing on making sure that the tips is getting the majority of the highlights, and then it starts to fade into nothing. And the last step is to add a little bit of white into the mixture to add the final highlights to the horns. And like I did before, I'm going to focus on adding the majority of the paint on the tips of the horn and then start to fade in. I just go over the areas that I want to have brighter, then start to add less and less pressure on those areas that I just want a little bit of a tint of a highlight, but still want to enhance the textures of the horns. And that's it. This is the final result of how I created this realistic looking paint job on this metal skull sculpture. And this is just part one in a two-part series of a dark academia decoration project that I'm working on. So stay tuned for that video, which is coming also pretty soon. So I hope you really enjoyed this video and found it entertaining and hopefully helpful if you want to create a realistic paint job on a small skull sculpture, or just get an idea of how you can create a realistic effect if you just work on layers using dry brush and wash and different layering techniques of achieving the depth and the contrast that is going to enhance the look of something realistic instead of something that just looked painted. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next project.